Lesson 3, Communications. This section will be talking about how to use the radio and other forms of communication on the ambulance. Radios are still probably the most common way our dispatchers get in touch with us. They page us out over the radio, we acknowledge it on the radio, we typically talk to dispatch through it. But when we're talking to the hospital, usually we use the cell phone. The cell phone is becoming probably is becoming rapidly one of the most common way we talk to people. The system we have where I work, we do have our calls come out to us over something called Active 911. So we get the information about the call on our phones, and that's just kind of a backup to our radio. They page us out and they text it out at the same time. But I like it because it gets us the directions we need, so we don't have to do much for route planning when they send it to us over our cell phone. So I figure something like that will become more common in the near future. There is still some telemetry unit stuff being used. That was used a lot at the beginning, and it was done over radio frequencies, and then it kind of went away. But now the cell phone technology has come back. We're using it again. And the way we're using this now is almost all the information that's on our monitor, as far as things like 12 leads or heart rhythms, vital signs, and all that. We hit a transmit button, and it prints out at the emergency department or whatever facility you are going to. So you can be looking at it, and the doc can be looking at a printout of it, which is kind of nice. Satellite computers, not so much around here, but in some areas, I'm sure where they don't have great radio communication, satellite computers would be something that could be used, and maybe that's coming for all of us one of these days. When we're talking to dispatch or other hospital or talking to anybody on the radio, we try to do it at times we're not driving the ambulance. So when a call goes out, it gets paged out, we have to acknowledge it. That would kind of be like when the dispatch on a call, we acknowledge it, but then we also go en route. So they page us out, and we have to acknowledge it within so many seconds or a minute, or they'll page us out again, and then we go to the ambulance, and then we say that we're en route after we figure out where we're going. When we arrive on the scene, we need to, again, acknowledge or tell dispatch that we're on scene. One of the things I always think is kind of funny when I'm listening to the radio at work is how many people say they're on scene. You still hear the siren going in the background, and really they're not on scene. They're probably about 3 blocks away, but they saw the fire truck on scene, so they went ahead and said they were on scene a little early. Once we get on scene, we go in and we kind of see what's going on with the patient and with the scene, and we're supposed to do a scene update. And sometimes fire does that for us and gets vital signs and things and sends that information to us. But the other thing a scene update can do is, one of the places I worked, we had within, I think, 5 minutes of arrival on scene to acknowledge that we were code 4. And what code 4 meant was that we were okay. So if we were able to, within 5 minutes, and everything kind of seemed okay, and there was no safety issues, major safety issues that we saw, we would say we're code 4. But if something was going bad, or we walked in on a bad scene, we wouldn't say anything. And then in theory, if dispatch hadn't heard from us within 5 minutes, they were supposed to dispatch the police. And that didn't always work as well as it's supposed to. A lot of times they ended up calling you over and over and over again to see if you were code 4. And of course, if you were not, then you couldn't answer it. But it's a good idea if everybody does it properly. Once we get the patient loaded in the ambulance and we're getting ready to head to the hospital, we again acknowledge or contact dispatch and say that we're going to be departing the scene. A lot of times when we say we're going en route to the hospital, we say which hospital we're going to, and also if we have any extra riders, like a family member that might be riding with us. Now, en route to the medical facility is usually not the person that's driving the ambulance. That's going to be the patient care provider in the back that's going to do a radio report. And then once we back into the ambulance bay at the hospital, the parking spot at the hospital, then we acknowledge that we're on scene at the hospital. And then when we clear the hospital, we let dispatch know that we're back in service and we're headed back to our station. The person that's driving should be driving. The person in the passenger seat should be doing things like helping with route navigation and operating the lights and sirens and handling the radio. That way the person driving can focus just on the driving. Now, dispatchers, I have dispatched. It's a tough job. I don't think I would ever do it again. I think the last time I did it was at Christmas Eve, and nothing ever happens on Christmas Eve. So I came in and worked for, I don't know, 5, 6 hours so our dispatcher could go do some Christmas stuff with their family. And when I got there, nothing had happened at all Christmas Eve, so clock in at 6 p.m., and by 6:05, all 6 of my ambulances were on the road running calls, and they never saw the station the rest of the night, so I was told I couldn't dispatch anymore. But hats off to my dispatchers. It's a tough job. They have to get in all the calls, talk to the people, provide pre-arrival instructions so they can give them first aid instructions on how to take care of the person on the scene. They handle all of the calls happening for your service, plus then we're doing things like calling, oh, we need fire department, we need air evac, we need TCC, we need utility department, so they're having to coordinate with them too. Lots of things to have to handle. As I said earlier, we only want to try and talk during non-driving points. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes we will end up having to talk to dispatch while we're driving. But ideally, the passenger EMT will do that, and the driver EMT will just drive. So try to put it in park and then say they're on scene. So when do you do this? Anytime you are given a call, you have to acknowledge it and say you're en route. When you arrive on the scene, when we depart the scene, when we arrive at the medical facility, when we're back in service. And anytime we're away from the ambulance, it used to be a bigger deal than it is now. Right now, if I'm away from my ambulance and my supervisor or my dispatcher can't get me, they just call my cell phone. But in the old days, with sometimes poor radio coverage, we would have to acknowledge or tell dispatch that we were going to be out of the ambulance and where we were going to be so they could get in touch with us. Now, I disagree with this one a little bit, that we have to know the address and the description of the emergency. And the reason I don't like description of the emergency is that oftentimes it is wrong. Dispatch gets the best information they can, they give it to us, but by the time we get there, it's not exactly what we were told, or dispatch was told. But we definitely need to know the location. Now, that being said, if I can get a bit of a description, I do like that, just so I have some idea of what to possibly bring in with me or what to expect, kind of get my mind thinking about what I might be facing. When we're using the radio equipment on the ambulance, we need to know who we're talking to. In the old days, the screens weren't on the radio, so we couldn't see what frequency we were talking on. We just knew we were on channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to however many frequencies you had. So somewhere we had it written down that channel 1 was like dispatch, and channel 2 was hospital, and channel 3 would be like Florence Fire, and channel 4 would be Tuscumbia Police, and channel 5 would be, EMA, whatever it was. But the handhelds were different than the ambulances. So channel 1 on my handheld radio may be dispatch, where it's channel 2 in the ambulance, and that got confusing. So we wanted to keep an up-to-date list of radio frequencies in the ambulance or on the radio. But nowadays with the screens, that's not a big of a deal. Now, in the old days, we also had all sorts of signals and codes, trying to keep it all secret from what the public was listening to, so they didn't know what we were doing. And that really didn't work, because you could buy books back in the day of what all the frequencies and all the 10 codes were. Nowadays, you just go online and look them up. So we kind of did away with them and went back to just talking in plain language, and then this came out. Call the Cops reported that FEMA and Department of Human Services, Health Services, were to mandate new 10 code use for all of us. And if you read through the article here, you can see that they were anticipating somewhere upwards of 300 codes, so you would have to memorize what all 300 of those 10 codes were. Now, if you read this closer, you'll see that Call the Cops is America's 27th most trusted source for public safety news. This is a spoof site, satire, fake news, I guess would be the term we use today. But when this came out as a joke, I got probably hundreds of Facebook messages and texts and calls, seeing if I knew what this was and when we were going to have to start learning all these, and what a pain in the rear it was going to be to try to memorize 300 codes and all that. And we're not doing this, but it was funny to read. Call the Cops has also reported that Boston EMS was going to allow the on-duty crews to drink 2 beers a shift. And poor Boston EMS, in the weeks following the article coming out on this website, which again was a joke, had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people applying to Boston EMS so they could drink while they were at work. Kind of funny. The problem with 10 codes and signals and all that is Sheffield may have one, Florence has another, Florence Fire has somebody else, Tuscumbia has another set, Keller has another set, Shoals Ambulance has another set. So you run a signal 41 with a 1050 and a 1096 with a 33, and what in the world did we just go on? And if you were in Florence, you knew. If you were in Tuscumbia, that was something else, and it was just too confusing. So we've gone to plain language. Just remember, anytime you're talking on the radio, even though it's fairly well encoded and secure nowadays, there are hackers out there that can figure out ways around these systems. So it might be heard, and if the systems haven't been updated to the latest technology, and then you're talking on a radio frequency that really anybody can listen to. So we try not to use the full name. Only say what you have to say. Don't say anything extra or more. It just ties up the frequency, and somebody may need to be talking to dispatch. And never, ever, ever say anything inappropriate or joke about anything on a radio, because if it is a frequency that's being recorded by dispatch, that will be there forever, and it's public record, so it may be on the news later that night, and you sure don't want to be caught joking about something. It may be funny, but it just looks bad to the public. So when we're composing our messages, think before you speak. I love it when a new person gets on the radio, because it's like, this is, we're in ambulance, yeah, and anybody know what unit this is? Okay, yeah, we're in 905, and we're bringing somebody to you, and you can just tell they hadn't thought about what they were going to say. Now, this identify the person called and then the calling unit. So this would be something like, dispatch, this is Keller 905. And the reason we do that is, you'll see when you do your rotations, is most of the time dispatch is on a computer, or they're watching something on Netflix, or they're kind of just daydreaming, and they're not really paying attention. So until they hear their name called, which is dispatch or 911, then they're not paying attention. So you can say all sorts of stuff on the radio, but until they hear their name, they're not going to hear it. So start with calling them first. Be pretty brief in what you say. Try not to tie up the frequency for too long. Keep it under a minute. Some services have radios that will stop transmitting after a minute, just so it doesn't, occasionally we'll toss the radio down or set something down on a microphone, and it'll key the mic, and that could tie up a frequency for hours until we figure out where it's coming from. So after a minute or so, they turn off. Again, no 10 codes, signals, all that fancy stuff. Just use English. Pronounce clearly. I don't like spell phonetically. It's just confusing to me. But if you spell it like it sounds versus spell it like it's spelled, sometimes people understand that better. And we oftentimes will echo things back when we're given a direction, especially if you're talking to medical control and they tell you to administer 0.4 of nitroglycerin. You would then repeat that back, saying 10-4, I'm going to administer 0.4 of nitroglycerin. That's just so we're all clear on what's being done and we don't make a medication error. This phonetic alphabet is A alpha, B bravo, C Charlie, D delta, all the way through. And unless you're in the military, nobody really knows this. So you start getting into other ones like J's, and you get things like, J John, or Jimmy, or J Jukebox, and you end up with just whatever letter word you can think of starts with the letter J, and it's probably not correct. But the idea is that if you're in an area where it's hard to hear, the reception's poor, a lot of static, if you start using those words, we might be able to spell out what you're saying. A little confusing unless you use it on a regular basis, so not something you hear a lot. I guess the exception for that might be like if you're going to 155 George Wallace Boulevard, apartment A Alpha, they might say something like that. So we try to use affirmative versus negative, affirmative versus yes and no. 50 will say 50, 15 will say 15, because 50 and 15 sometimes get a little confused. In fact, with most numbers, we will just say something like 155, we would say is 155. This is one of those things that will change in you. You'll start using this stuff, and your wife will ask you for a number, and you'll spell it out that way, or she'll ask you a location, and you give her a street corner, and that she looks at you a little weird. So you start using some of these other terms just because that's what we use at work so much. So make sure the frequency is clear. There's not anybody else talking or has something important to say. And when it's clear, then you can press the microphone key. And oftentimes you'll hear a click or a chirp. And what has happened is the radio in your ambulance has hit the nearest repeater tower, who has then hit another repeater tower, who has then hit dispatch. And all those links have connected, and that's what the chirp is. Once you hear that click or chirp, then you can start talking. Talk with the microphone fairly close to your mouth. And then when you're done, don't say 10-4, over, clear, good buddy, something like that. But just 10-4 is usually what we say at the end to let everybody know we're kind of done. So this would be an example of how it would work. As the ambulance operator, you would say, dispatch, this is unit 4-2, and then dispatch would say, 4-2, this is dispatch, ready to copy, and then you can go through all this. To be honest, we tend to say things faster. If this was me, I'd probably say, dispatch, this is unit 42-4-2, we're on scene, switching to the hospital frequency. And then I would wait a moment, and dispatch would probably say 10-4, and that would be it. You can look in your EVOC manual for all the different ground guides to see what we use for those. Realize that anytime you are backing up, you have all these blind zones behind you, blind spots. Really, the rearview mirror is only good to look at your partner and the patient to see if there's something going on back there where your partner's getting into trouble. You can't use your rearview mirror to see behind you in an ambulance. You can use your side mirrors, but that keeps you from seeing directly behind the ambulance. So anytime you're backing up, try to use a ground guide. Now I know at like the hospital, you can't get your partner out because they have to deal with the patient. But if you're on scene, there's usually a first responder, firefighter, somebody on scene that can help guide you. And anytime you're backing in at the station or a restaurant, something like that, get out and help your partner. Go back there and be the ground guide. All ambulance services require that in their SOPs. All right, any questions? Just ask me in class.